In lesson 3, we're going to talk about workspaces. So what I've done is I've already opened up Photoshop after closing it down after the last lesson that we did. So I've got it open and my Photoshop looks to be like I set it up to be in my preferences. But this whole space that we're in right now is called your workspace. And there are many different types of workspaces. So if we click up here, right on this little icon right here, you're going to see different types of workspaces. This is the Essentials workspace. This is basically Photoshop saying, here are the essential things that you need to know to use Photoshop, or that you need to have open to use Photoshop. Then we have 3D. This would be the 3D workspace, or all the tools that are necessary to make a good 3D workspace. Then we have graphic and web. But notice how as this changes in this workspace over here, my toolbar changes as well. Okay, so that's very important to note that the things that happen in these workspaces as you change them, it's not only setting up your right-hand side sidebar, it's also setting up your toolbars and the tools that you use, and basically setting up the tools that you're going to be using within that workspace. It's basically saying, hey, if you're a video editing person, hit motion. This is going to give you your timeline below, which I actually use Photoshop quite a bit to edit video. So this is a workspace that I do hop into when I want to do video editing. If I click on that icon again, we have our photography workspace. And this is what Photoshop says is the essential workspace for photographers. Okay. Now, that is up to you to decide whether that is exactly what you want. I don't necessarily just go by the fact that this is what Photoshop says is that workspace. I'll sometimes just make my own workspace, my own custom workspace, but everything changes. My toolbars here, over here on the left-hand side change. These toolbars, my secondary toolbar changes, and all my navigation panes change. So let's go ahead and change this to the photography workshop, and I'll show you how to set this up for your setup. So you see I have all my different panels here that I have, from the Zone Sim Express to Palette Effects to the Creative Live panel to the Export panel to the Dodge and Burn panel and Palette Effects, which is my beta. If it's in orange like that, it's a beta. These are panels that I use for my workflow. We're not necessarily talking about those at this point, but I know that you might wonder what all these beautiful colored buttons over here are for. Those are essentially all the panels that I've built. But in this photography workspace, you'll see things like your navigator and your histogram. Well, the navigator is basically something that shows you where you are on your document as you navigate around it. Well, guess what? I don't typically use the navigator a whole lot. So I'll just click and drag this navigator out and I can just delete it, just get it off of there. I didn't get rid of it completely. If we go to Window and we go down here, you'll see Navigator. I can put that navigator back if I wanted to. So we're not deleting it. We're just saying, get it off of my workspace. There are times that sometimes you might lose all of these areas over here and be like, what the heck happened? Where'd they go? Well, maybe it gets disconnected and deleted or something like that. You're like, whoa. You can't just press Control Z to undo that. Where did that go? Where did my history go? It doesn't matter. If you go over to Window, history is right here, okay? And right here, because history, properties, and libraries were together at one point, they're going to come back together. So we'll just click and drag this over here and put it right above that layers palette. Now libraries, I don't use libraries a whole lot in my actual workflow as far as me working on my images, but as far as my business is concerned, I use libraries quite a bit. So if I make my YouTube videos, for instance, they all have the text on a document. I have a library item that is actually stored in my Creative Cloud file that I've dragged a setup working document into that library. So anytime I can pull up and call on that and reuse it. That's why all the text always looks the same on my YouTube video thumbnails. That's because I have a place that's very specifically stored on here that shows me those things. So if I were to double click on, let's say this one, it says template for video. Guess what? This is the template that I use for some of my videos. And it's got that grouping in there. That's all stored in the cloud. So I don't have to find it somewhere on my PC. So libraries can be helpful. If you want to use libraries, I would keep that there. I do keep my history right here. And I also keep properties right here. Down here we have layers, channels, and paths. Well, paths are typically something that I use in graphic design, and I don't use them a whole lot in my photography workflow. So I'll click paths, drag it out, and exit out of it. Channels, that's another thing. I don't do a whole lot with channels. Now, sometimes I will do some things with channels when I'm making masks, but when I make those masks, I'm making them from channels, and I just have the mask anyway. It's very rare that I actually jump into the channels to see what my RGB channels have in them. Some photographers do though, and some photographers will swear that you have to have those channels there. That's up to them. If I don't need them there, I can get rid of them. If you don't use something in here, you can get rid of it. The histogram, that's something that I will get rid of too at the top here. So that I don't have a histogram there anymore. Why is that? Well, that's because the things like curves adjustment layers, they have a histogram in them already, right? Well, some people swear by having that histogram there because they can always see it. So we can put the histogram back up there if we'd like. Now the histogram is great because it allows us to see all the tonal values and colors in our image. So I'm not discrediting it at all. I'm just saying that you need to think about how you work in Photoshop. If you don't use something, don't have it in your workspace. It's not going to help you. It's just going to clutter it up and make you less efficient in Photoshop. And we're talking about Photoshop proficiency here and getting everybody good at this stuff, right? So if we go up to this workspace section now, we've got this set up to the way we want it to. One thing about these tools over here to the left is that when I change to the photography workspace, all my tools changed as well. So if that happened to you and you were playing with tools from the last lesson, this is a lesson to you to know that if you change your workspace up here, if you go to edit and you go to toolbar, you're going to see that certain things are not included over here in that photography workspace, like the single column marquee tool. Why is that? Well, it's typically because that's a graphic design element, not necessarily a photography element. So if you lose some of the tools that you did have over here, just know that you're going to have to come back over to your extra tools and drag them and drop them over into this category so that they are usable tools. For the most part, most of these tools that I see in here aren't tools that I'm using too much anyway, so I can just go ahead and press done. The reason why I show you that though is because when you go to workspaces and you say new workspace, you can save this as your own workspace. So when I say new workspace, it's going to say, what do you want to call this? Well, I'm going to call it Blake's. We'll just call this basics workspace so that I know that this is the workspace I use for this lesson. Here we have keyboard shortcuts. If I changed any keyboard shortcuts, I didn't show you that one yet. I'll show you that in a second. We'll click on that icon. If I change any of the menus, I'll click on that icon. If I change any of the tools in the toolbars, I'll check that icon. So what this means now is that this basics workspace will include any new keyboard shortcuts, any of those menus that are put in there, in any of the toolbars. So I'll press save. Now when I go up to this workspace, you'll see that I've got the basics workspace up there. So if I go over here to edit and go to keyboard shortcuts, there are certain things that I talk about hotkeys. Well, those are shortcuts. Like pressing Command or Control J will duplicate your image, right? That's a hotkey that's already set up right here in the shortcuts menu in Photoshop. There are certain things that we don't necessarily have a shortcut for that you would think, why don't we have a shortcut for that? Like one of them is layer. If I go down to layer, and we go down to the very bottom of this, and it's flatten layer is what I'm looking for, is flatten. It's at the very bottom. Flatten image doesn't have a hotkey. Well, you would think, well, why wouldn't flatten image have a hotkey? So here you can set up a hotkey for that. What type of hotkey? Well, think about things like Control and Shift and Alt. So if I were to click inside this box and press Control and comma, it's saying Control and comma is already in use by another one, which is layer, hide layers. So maybe Control period. Well, Control period, that's not taken. So I can use that hotkey as now the flatten image hotkey. So basically, I'd like to think of it as like when you end a sentence and that sentence is done, you press period. Well, now if I press Control and period, I'm flattening my image. Let's see if Control Alt period is used. Control Alt period is also not something that's in use. So if you want to assign a hotkey to something, you can use Control and period, Control Alt and period. If by chance you press Control and the, let's see, / it's going to say this is already in used by layer, lock layers. So we don't want that. Press Control period. You can commit to it and override the shortcut that Photoshop already has in place for that hotkey. But I don't recommend doing it because if you ever watch one of my tutorials or somebody else's tutorials and they say to use the hotkey of Control and / and you reset it to something else, then you're not going to get the desired results that somebody else does. That's why a lot of times I don't really customize Photoshop too far outside of what Photoshop is already set up for, because certain things would just be very specific to me and to me only. So now if I press OK to this, and then when I was to go up and save this workspace, it'll save those shortcuts, it'll save the toolbars, and it'll save any of those menu items into this workspace. So now if I were to go up here and change this to something like maybe the motion workspace, it changes everything over, right? But then if I go back to that basics workspace, look at that. If I click on the photography workspace, well, this is already set up. It saved itself from the things that I've done. So if I wanted to reset this to the default of what Photoshop says is the photography workspace, I'd say reset the photography workspace. And this is what Photoshop would suggest is the photography workspace. I still have my basic workspace. I even have another workspace called Blake's workspace. So I highly recommend that you get into these workspaces, get your preferences set up correctly, get your toolbars set up correctly, get rid of things that you don't need, okay? And then get this workspace set up exactly like you want it and save your workspace. That way you can always access it. If something gets changed and you go to photography or you go to motion, you can always go back to your workspace and not lose all of that stuff that you took the time to set up. I do have one more cool thing to show you about Workspace that deals with the color of the workspace that you choose. So as we discussed, Photoshop has 4 different types of workspace. We've got this light gray, almost white workspace. We've got this neutral gray workspace. We've got this darker gray workspace. And then we have almost like a midnight dark workspace. Now, you might think to yourself, well, this one just looks prettier than the rest of them. Or I like the way this one looks with the contrast on this better than these ones. And that's okay. But, I talk about things like color theory all the time. And here's why I want to give you a lesson in color theory based on the workspace that you choose to work in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and just close this down and I'm going to open up this document. So this little document that I have here shows you what different colors look like on different workspaces. So this is the lightest and darkest workspaces. Look at the very different coloring that's happening here. This color that I'm showing you right here is the exact same color on both sides. If we were to turn this off and shut off this mask, this is the same color. It's all blue, okay? This is what this color blue looks like on these different interfaces. On these 2 different interfaces, that light blue color on the lightest workspace looks light blue, doesn't it? But that light blue on the darkest workspace almost looks white. Now let's look at it on the middle interfaces. It's not so bad on the middle interfaces. On these 2 extremes of the workspace that you would work in Photoshop, the lightest one and the darkest one, you're going to see a very high contrast difference between lighter colors and darker colors. Your darker colors will appear extremely dark on that light interface. Your light colors will appear extremely light on that dark interface. So as you're editing your images, if you print in your image and you're like, well, why does this not look anything like it looks on my screen? Well, there's a lot of variables. There's your printer profiles, there's the way your monitor is set up, but there's also the fact that maybe you're working in a workspace that's too dark or too light. Because our eyes are going to play tricks on us when we look at this color, don't they? If I were to click on this color and change this to something like even a middle blue, like right there. Look at the difference here. Even that middle blue looks like a really dark blue on that light background, but it looks like a light blue on the darkest dark background, or a lighter blue, I should say, not a light blue. But if we change this to something like this color right here, this is like a grayish color here. It's about 25% into gray. Well, that actually looks like gray on this light background, but that gray looks like white on that dark background. Change over to the middle interface. Look at the drastic change. Now these almost look like the same color again, don't they? This is how our eyes are going to play tricks on us as we're editing our images. There's that middle interface, and there is the light and dark interface. Notice how the color on the left, that light red, kind of gets washed away with that gray. But look over here. It's very bright and very vibrant. Our colors are going to look different. Our tones are going to look different based on the workspace that we're working in. So what does this mean for you? Well, I want you to think about this, and I want you to conduct an experiment. And what I want you to do with this experiment is I want you to take an image and I want you to edit it on the lightest workspace. I want you to then take a break. Change your workspace to the next workspace up, the next darkest one up. Edit that same image. Just don't try to recreate what you did essentially. Just edit on that different workspace. Then take a break, come back, do the next one, and repeat that process for all the workspaces. Then look at your images and how they're drastically different. They might be slightly different, or they might be drastically different based on the decisions that you made because of the intensity of the colors of the background of the thing that you are working on. It might sound crazy. You might say, Blake, you really look this far into Photoshop? Yes, I do. And even what you could do is take the image that you're working on currently, if you don't want to go through all the steps to do all 4 of those, process an image on the darkest dark, and then look at it on the lightest light. Watch all the colors just change. It will happen. I know it will happen because that's how color theory works. It's how colors interact on the workspace that they're in. So be thinking about these things. How does it change my decision? Well, after doing the research on it, I actually found that I preferred this workspace right here the best. That's what I preferred. It was a nice medium contrast. It didn't have too light colors or too dark colors happening in the background. And it just happened to be the workspace that I adapt to the best and work the best in. But this may be one of those things that you may have never thought about before, that now you're never going to not be able to think about it. So run that experiment. See what happens before you move on to the next lesson. In the next lesson, we're talking about image size versus canvas size, because they are very different.